Okay, this is the last class of the semester, and that means this is the review for the final exam. And two of you are taking the class for credit, so I will be emailing the final to you tonight when I get home after class. And you'll have a week to fill it out and just shoot it back to me via email. If any of those of you who are taking the class just auditing, if you want a copy of the final, I'll be happy to send you one. I've got an extra with me if you want one, Ms. Shante. And you can just take that. If you want to get it back to me, I'll grade it for you. If not, you can just have it for your own reference. At any rate, looking at the books of Kings and Chronicles, let's go back and just sort of review briefly the background of not just Kings and Chronicles, but prophetic literature generally. Kings and Chronicles are, strictly speaking, not prophetic so much as historical literature, but they do incorporate a lot of prophetic statements and records of prophetic work and various prophets. And so the prophetic literature in the scriptures is there to give us a more complete picture of the history of the ancient world, and particularly, but not exclusively, the ancient Hebrews. I mean, you think about it in Kings and Chronicles, we hear about Israel and Judah, the 12 tribes, but we also learn bits and pieces about Moab and Ammon and Edom and the Philistines and Syria and the Assyrian Empire and the Babylonian Empire and the Medo-Persian Empire, all of these ancient cultures, not to mention the Babylonians before they became an empire and the Syrians before they became an empire, when they were just large kingdoms and so forth. So we actually get a lot of ancient history just by reading and studying the Kings and the Chronicles. It gives us a more complete view of ancient world history. It also helps us to understand something of the social and the cultural and the economic circumstances that existed in that ancient time, because you've got the various competing cultures. We see the thing that probably stands out the most is the differences in religion between the different cultures and God's people. But it also helps us have a better understanding and a better appreciation of the laws and the practices, and in some cases, the rituals of the ancient Hebrews, God's people, as they were trying to either depart from him into idolatry, or as they were trying to clean themselves up and come back to righteous living. We see the challenges that are involved in that. And you see some of the greatest moral and ethical teaching presented in the ancient world right here in Kings and Chronicles. It's interesting, you also, when you read between the lines, as it were, you see some of the greatest religious and doctrinal concepts in all of history right here in this particular part of the scriptures. You see the nature of man and the character of God. You see the contrast between sin and condemnation on one side and redemption and salvation on the other side. Just from a purely literary point of view, you have some of the finest literature that any era of the world has ever produced. And even modern literary authorities look at the scriptures and recognize this is, even if this is not inspired, this is great literature, but on top of that, it's inspired. It's God's instructions for his people. It gives us some of the most beautiful aspirational statements and just figures of speech and turns of phrase. Winston Churchill in the World War II generation was rightly famous for his ability to turn a phrase, to express ideas in words that people would remember. I have nothing to offer you but blood and toil and sweat and tears and things like that. We shall fight on the landing fields and on the beaches and so forth. Well, you find those same expressions of ideas in the Kings and Chronicles. And then you see some of the most profound emotions expressed. Think about David. Of course, this is actually going back into Samuel now, but think about David's care for his son Absalom. Even as Absalom is in open rebellion against him, he says, you deal gently with the young man. And then when word comes that Absalom has been executed, really murdered, what's David's response to that? Oh, Absalom, Absalom, my son, would to God that I had died for thee, oh, Absalom, my son. Expressions of deepest emotion. Perhaps the most important aspect of studying prophetic literature, the Old Testament, the historical literature, above all of these other things, is the simple fact that this gives us a background for understanding better and more fully statements and figures that are presented in the New Testament. I had an old friend years ago when I was a much younger preacher who used to repeat an expression he had learned from an older brother named Noble Patterson. And that is, the Old Testament shows us Christ concealed, and the New Testament presents Christ revealed. Exactly. And there's a great deal of truth to that statement. Now, on a practical level, what purpose do these books serve in the scriptures? Well, as history, they served to appeal to these people, to God's people in this time period, to turn back to an upright religious and moral and spiritual condition, to turn away from the condition into which they'd fallen, and to turn back to God, to lead them on to a higher, a better moral and spiritual level. They also warned, just like Isaiah did, for example, and Elijah and Elisha, of impending calamity. Punishment is coming because of sin. Think about the work of Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel to a lesser degree. Daniel focusing more on the farther future, and Jeremiah and Ezekiel on the immediate future. Judgment's coming, and there's no avoiding it. No way to get around it. So submit to it, bear it gracefully, and be redeemed. And of course, the people didn't want to do that. Ezekiel and Daniel focusing heavily on the promise of a better day to come. And of course, from the Jewish point of view, at the end of this period of the kings, that better day to come is the end of Babylonian captivity and the release of God's people from their servitude and their deportation, and the ability to go home, rebuild Jerusalem, rebuild the temple, rebuild the walls. But contextually, you look at Ezekiel and Daniel and Zephaniah and so forth, Zechariah, they're looking forward ultimately to the Messianic era, to the time after the law of Moses, when the Christ will have come and established his kingdom. And the church is in view here. Colossians chapter 1, verses 13 through 18 shows us that the kingdom is the body, is the church. You can't be in one without being in the other. So if you're in the church, you're in the kingdom. If you're in the kingdom, you're in the body. If you're in the body, you're part of the bride. If you're part of the bride, you're in the church. They all go together. There's no separating them out one from another. Now, on a purely functional level, this is a record, a preserved record of the activities and the lineages of the Hebrew people. But this greater purpose is to direct them, and anybody else that would listen for that matter, through the sermons and the revelations that are given to these prophets, and or through the guidance that they give, to direct them toward God. The prophets that we see in these books, whether it's Nathan and Gad and Samuel, or Isaiah, here in Kings and Chronicles, or Elijah and Elisha and Oded and what have you. These are the religious and moral teachers of the day. Now, bear in mind, the Levites, and particularly the priestly families among the Levites, that was their responsibility too. That was their primary purpose in life, was to teach, to be moral and spiritual guides. And as we see, especially near the end of the kingdom of Judah, coming down to the days of Jehoahaz and Jehoiachin and Jehoiakim and Zedekiah, they're not doing their job. And so God sends prophets to call them back. These men are advisors to the rulers. And the interesting thing there is, where do we see half of these prophets? Elijah and Elisha and even Isaiah. They're prophesying in Israel, the northern kingdom, where the official religion of the government, of the king, of the rulers, and the majority of the people is idolatry, homemade, dreamed up for themselves idolatry. And yet God is still sending them prophets to be advisors to the rulers, and not just to the rulers, but to the people generally. They promote the doctrines of Israel, not the northern kingdom Israel, but the doctrines of God's people. They're basically the reformers of that age. One of the things that we see clearly in 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles is that the work, the meaning, the purpose of a prophet and the idea of prophecy is not what we typically think of in the 21st century. If you're over about 40 or so years old, then you'll remember the name Jean Dixon from the newspapers, and how she was hailed as a sort of prophetess in her own time for all of her predictions. And yet, on her best day, she got about 10% of her predictions right. And Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 15 and following tell us that if a prophet prophesies something, especially if they prophesy something in the name of the Lord, and a single part of it does not come to pass, then don't believe them, don't give them any credibility. They're false prophets. They're speaking presumptuously. They're not inspired by God. Well, we tend to think of prophecy, our society, our culture tends to think of prophecy as predicting future events, foretelling what's going to happen tomorrow or next week or next month or next year or 100 years from now. And what we see here is that there is some of that. You think about Josiah being prophesied by name and what he would do in defiling idolatrous altars. That's foretold 330 years before it actually takes place. He's not even a twinkling in his great grandfather's eye at that point, but the prophet names him by name for what he'll do. Well, there is some of that, but the majority of prophetic work, as we see it here, is repeating and repeating and repeating and repeating things that had already been revealed. How many times do the prophets, just here in Kings and Chronicles, direct the kings and direct the priests and direct the people back to things that Moses had said hundreds of years before? So it's what really, on a practical level, the biggest part of what they do constitutes what we would describe as preaching, teaching, guiding the people in the instructions that God had already given, and not revealing necessarily new information every time they spoke, every time they opened their mouths. So as we look at 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, the books that Samuel wrote, 1st and 2nd Samuel, that gives us the origin of the monarchy, of the kings in Israel and Judah. It shows how that the ruling family in Judah comes from the root of Jesse, that is, from David's family. Jesse, of course, is David's father. Kings picks up where 2nd Samuel leaves off. It takes up the the history of God's people in the ancient world from the time that David hands off the kingdom to Solomon, his youngest son, which in itself is unusual because Solomon's the youngest son. And normally it would be the oldest son that takes the reins. But in this circumstance, it's from David to Solomon, and it follows the history of both kingdoms, north and south, from that time until the collapse of each of them. The northern kingdom, conquered and deported by the Assyrians, ultimately in 721 BC, and the remaining southern kingdom, which is not any better morally, in fact, in some ways is worse, has a murderous queen who tries to stamp out the royal lineage, Athaliah, and has two of their kings, Ahaz and Manasseh, who actually offered their own children as burnt offerings to idols, which we don't read about that taking place in the northern kingdom. So in some ways, Judah becomes worse than the northern kingdom, but Judah is finally conquered and goes into captivity to the Babylonians in 586 BC. In both cases, there's about a 20-year process that leads up to that cataclysmic event for both kingdoms. And in both cases, the people of the nations, north and south, are deported in stages until the conquest and the deportation, the destruction is complete. The books of First and Second Kings, known in Hebrew as Kings, one book most likely, is basically a chronicle of what happens from generation to generation in these two kingdoms. It shows us how that we go from one kingdom to two because of the foolishness of Solomon's son Rehoboam. It shows us how generously God offered to bless Jeroboam if he would just trust God, and how foolishly Jeroboam turned away from God. The northern kingdom, Israel, has 10 tribes. Sometimes it's described by the name of its largest leading tribe, Ephraim. And the southern kingdom, Judah, basically has two tribes, Judah and Benjamin, and then a smattering of people plus the Levites from most of the other tribes when they're driven out of Israel. The northern kingdom has 9 separate ruling families, 9 dynasties over the time of their history, roughly 200 or so years. 20 kings, 9 different families. The southern kingdom has 20 kings, all in one family. Not all of them are father to son. Some of them wind up being brothers, but 20 kings, all of the same family. Israel, the northern kingdom, does not have one single righteous king. Every one of them is ungodly, unrighteous, idol-worshiping, evil people. Judah has 8 out of their 20 kings who get at least some degree of praise. Now you've got Joash and Hezekiah and Josiah that really stand out in Judah. And you've got several others that are pretty good. And then you've got men like Manasseh who start out truly terrible. And before everything is said and done, they repent and improve. And God takes note of those changes. All told, the books of First and Second Kings cover about 400 years of Hebrew history. So from the time of Moses leading Israel out of Egyptian bondage to the time of Saul and David, the time of the kingdom being established with a human king. Remember, Samuel tells the people, you didn't reject me as your prophet. You've rejected God from being your king. You've got about 400 roughly 400 years. If you include the time of conquest, 450 to 500 years. And then you've got about 400 years from the first king down to the last king. So you've got between Moses and captivity, roughly speaking, 800, possibly as much as 900 years. Now, Chronicles that we talked about, First and Second Chronicles, are the prophetic or the priestly presentation, not of both kingdoms, but specifically of the kingdom of Judah. And the difference between Kings and Chronicles, besides the focus, Israel and Judah versus just Judah, or almost exclusively Judah, the difference is that Kings was written pretty much during the time frame that it is taking place. You may have more than one individual involved in the recording of the book of Kings, First and Second Kings. Chronicles is written after captivity. It's a look back, it's a history, and it emphasizes the ruling family and the identity of the people of Judah as God's people. The term Chronicles means records, and it was called the record of things omitted, or the record of days in the Hebrew Bible, the old ancient Hebrew texts, and it's called Chronicles since the time of Jerome. And we have these books in First and Second, or Part A, Part B, because of the amount of material that could be written on a typical scroll in that ancient, not quite so ancient time. In the original forms, they would have been written in one continuous record, but now we have them broken up as they were presented when they were translated. So let's get to the contents of First and Second Kings and First and Second Chronicles. When you come into First Kings, David is still alive. David the king, the greatest of Hebrew kings, the second king after Saul. Saul, of course, is a Benjaminite, and he is deposed by God. He rules for 40 years. He dies in battle, still with the crown on his head. But long before that, God had already determined to replace him, and Samuel had already appointed David, the youngest son of Jesse, a Jew of the tribe of Judah, to be his replacement. And of course, we know that Saul had tried to resist. The Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul. It rested on David. Saul had tried to resist. He had tried to murder David over and over and over and over again. Tried to turn his own son Jonathan against David, who these two were the best of friends, had a covenant between them. And so when we come to First Kings, David is an old man. Now, old is a relative term. David's going to be approximately 70 when he dies. He rules 40 years. He's 30 at the time that he becomes king in Hebron. Good evening, sir. Come on in. And so by the time he dies, he's described as an old man. From our standards, he's really not that old, but you think about how he has spent his life. During his 20s, he's been on the run. Saul has been trying to murder him. He has had to live a rough life during his young manhood. He has had a number of wives. He has fathered numerous children. He has made his share of mistakes. He has paid heavily for his mistakes. His oldest son has raped one of his daughters. The full brother of the daughter, that's Amnon, has raped Tamar and then cast her out, wants nothing to do with her. Tamar's brother from the same mother, Absalom, has waited 2 years and then murdered his own half-brother Amnon for what he did to Tamar, and then has been in exile, finally comes back. But as the sin of David with Bathsheba is exposed by Nathan, all of these events among his children turn out to be consequences of that sin. One of the things that Nathan, God's spokesman, God's prophet, tells David is, because of your sin, there will always be tumult and turmoil among your house, your descendants. Sure enough, there was. And all of these things take place. Absalom mounts an open rebellion against his father, seeks to commit regicide, kill his father in order to become king, and ultimately winds up losing in conflict with his father's forces and is himself murdered. And David, as we pointed out a while ago, David mourns for Absalom rather than celebrating his own vindication. But when we come into 1 Kings, David is now an old man. His health has broken down to some degree. He can't get warm. The prevailing wisdom of the day is get him a young, attractive, healthy young woman, and she will impart some of her vitality to him. We read here in 1 Kings chapter 1. They did exactly that, brought in Abishag, and she was his companion, his nurse, but he never lived with her as husband and wife. He knew her not. He was past the point of interest in that at this point. May have been past the point of ability given his health. But she is described as the virgin from whom he got heat. That is, she kept him warm, among other things. Adonijah is his oldest remaining son. And from the people's point of view, from the normal way of doing things, Adonijah would seem to be the crown prince. He's the one who will succeed David. He's the oldest son. That's the way things normally go. And certainly Adonijah expects to be the next king. And in fact, we look at 1 Kings chapters 1 and 2, what do we find? As David is old, Adonijah now begins to take steps to try to ensure that he is the next king. He mounts a plot to have himself declared king. And Nathan the prophet, who has got to be a fairly old man himself at this point, comes and consults with Bathsheba, David's most recent wife, the mother of Solomon, and sends Bathsheba to David saying, hey, you better go remind David, he promised that Solomon would be the next king. Now, this is an unusual scenario because Solomon's basically the baby. He's the youngest of David's sons, as far as we know. He would not normally be first in line to the throne. But we learn later as we go along, number one, David had promised this to Bathsheba. Number two, the promise was of the Lord. It was the Lord's intention that Adonijah not be the next king, but that Solomon or Jedediah be the next king. And so as Adonijah is trying to steal the crown, basically, Nathan, Bathsheba remind David of what had already been decided about Solomon. And David gives the command, take Solomon to the Gihon spring and anoint him and crown him and proclaim him king. All of this going on at the same time, Adonijah's down the hill at En-Rogel trying to get himself proclaimed king. Go ahead, Mr. Paul.
I just want to ask, at that point, didn't King David marry Bathsheba? At that point, some point he married her.
David had married Bathsheba 7 days after Uriah died.
Okay.
That was
After
long.
the
That
baby
was
died.
that was long before.
Okay.
That was long before Solomon was not
So
only
they were
born,
married.
but
That's all I
yeah,
was-
yes, they were married before Solomon was ever conceived. There was a child before Solomon
Yeah.
that was conceived in their adultery,
Right.
and that child died. She
Right.
carried that child a full term. He was born alive, but that child died a matter of days after birth. That's where David spent hours prostrate on the ground, begging God to let it live, and it did not. And when David saw that that child had died, he gets up, washes his face, combs his hair, ready to eat, and his servants are astonished. And that's where David, this is back in 2 Samuel, says, he can't come to me, but I can go to him. And so he's dedicating his life at this point to going where that son is, where that child is. So here, Adonijah is the oldest son of David, the oldest remaining son, who tries to usurp his throne. And when that does not work, Adonijah ultimately comes to Bathsheba and asks, would you ask Solomon if I can have Abishag as my wife? Which is in itself an act of rebellion. It's staking a claim to the throne that had been passed on to Solomon. Now, the interesting thing is, as we look at these events, is that Joab, David's general, I won't say his trusted general, because Joab had proven himself untrustworthy at times. One of the things that stands out about Joab is that he was a behind the scenes maneuverer. He was always trying to control events, and sometimes he managed to do that, but it was never to the benefit of David alone. It was always with some eye to having some influence of his own on Joab's part. So Joab, the general, and Abiathar, who is the high priest at this point in time, when Adonijah is scheming to get himself declared king, they're on Adonijah's side. Now that makes sense from the standpoint that Joab particularly and Abiathar evidently were the sort of men who want to have some influence, who want to have some pull. And so they're trying to pull strings behind the scenes, and they can do that with Adonijah. They can't do that with Solomon. But on the other hand, you've got Zadok, who is also a priest, and you've got Benaiah, who is one of David's right-hand men, who are on Solomon's side. And Nathan the prophet is on David's side in making sure that David's will, which is according to God's will, is carried out. So Nathan and Bathsheba and Zadok and Benaiah carry out the king's commandment, take Solomon to the Gihon spring and crown him, anoint him and crown him and have him declared king and bring him in and sit him on my throne. So before Adonijah can finish his takeover, he's confronted with a done deal. The whole city has already acknowledged Solomon as king. Now Solomon is a boy king for all practical purposes. He's 18 or 20 perhaps at this point. So he's a young man. He may be half Adonijah's age, but he is on the throne. Adonijah at that point fears for his life. The precedent in most other kingdoms was that when one successor becomes the new king, the first thing he did was to wipe out anybody else with a claim to the throne besides his own children. Any brothers, any cousins, anybody like that, to consolidate his hold on power. Solomon does not do that with Adonijah. Adonijah is afraid that's what's going to happen. And Solomon simply asks for an oath, a promise. Basically, I promise to behave. All right, fine, go in peace. Well, that's where he then is going to come back shortly and ask for Abishag. And that's going to get him executed, because Solomon reads that, rightly so, as an effort to assert a claim to the throne. Normally, all of the wives and concubines of the previous king become the property of the current king, and that would include Abishag. Well, as Solomon deals with all of this maneuvering and plotting back and forth, Joab, on David's instructions, is executed by Benaiah at the horns of the altar. He has gone there to try to claim asylum, to try to claim shelter, but he is guilty of murder on more than one occasion. And Solomon carries out David's instructions, have him executed for those murders. Abiathar, the priest, is not executed. He's removed from being high priest and exiled to his home. In the meantime, there is also a descendant of Saul, Shimei. And Shimei, who had cheered for Adonijah, basically, or for Absalom, rather, when Absalom rebelled against David, Shimei has now come back and asked David's forgiveness and so forth. And Solomon places a restriction on him. Build yourself a house here in Jerusalem and don't leave town. Basically, he says, you stay right here where I can keep an eye on you. If you leave town, if you cross the brook Kidron, then your life is forfeit. Well, that sounds good to Shimei. I promise that's what I'll do. And he stays put just fine for a couple of years. And then two of his servants run away for whatever cause. And instead of reporting that, appealing for help, what have you, he goes, leaves town to chase them down, and his life winds up being forfeit for violating his parole. Now, when Solomon becomes king, God speaks to him. God offers him, God offers him the deal of a lifetime. Ask what you will, and I will grant it. Ask what you will. And what does Solomon ask for? Solomon could have asked for fabulous wealth. He could have asked for world dominating power. He could have asked for, the world's most beautiful woman or whatever. God said, you ask and I'll give it. What did Solomon ask for? He says, I'm a child. I don't know how to govern this people properly. Give me wisdom and an understanding heart, an understanding mind to govern your people so that I can discern, so that I can tell the difference between good and evil. Or who is able to govern this, your great people? Chapter 3 and verse 9. Now, it's interesting to note that before that takes place, Solomon has married. He's married a daughter of Pharaoh, and he brought her into Jerusalem, and he builds a house for her. She is not a Hebrew. She's not prohibited to him as some of the wives that he'll later marry, but he sets an unwise precedent. And I've sometimes wondered if that unwise precedent perhaps was part of his request. Give me wisdom and an understanding heart. He might, in one sense, already have been seeing this wasn't maybe the brightest thing I did to marry this foreign woman. Now, there is nothing said about the daughter of Pharaoh corrupting his morals or leading him astray. Later on, we read that his heart was led astray by many foreign women. But the daughter of Pharaoh doesn't seem to be in that number. And it may well be that she becomes a worshiper of God, but that's not addressed specifically anywhere in the scriptures. The thing that we can say about her is that there's nothing bad said about her in this context. So we move forward from Solomon's request. God says, you've asked a good thing. I'm pleased by this. I'll not only give you wisdom and understanding, I'll also bless you extravagantly. And Solomon proceeds over the balance of his life then to become probably the most staggeringly wealthy individual in the history of humanity. But in 1 Kings chapter 3, we have examples of his wisdom. And the thing that stands out is the two women who come before him with a child between the two of them, and a tale of woe, how that they'd both given birth to children, and one of them had rolled over on top of her child and smothered it in the night. And when she discovered it dead, swapped babies with the other one. And the other one's trying to appeal for, I want my child back. And they dispute over this. And Solomon settles the dispute by saying, bring a sword and divide the child in half, give each one of them half of it. That exposes right off the bat who the genuine mother is, because she'd rather see her child given away to a thief than to see her child divided in half, literally killed, so they each get what they want. And that exposes the other woman as the liar. As we progress through Solomon's reign, now bear in mind, if you go over to First Chronicles takes us all the way back in terms of the chronology of things. First Chronicles takes us all the way back to the beginning of time, basically, and shows us the lineage of the house of David from the standpoint of this begins with Adam and progresses forward. Chronicles gives us insight into the house of David that we don't always get in Kings. We get more about the northern kingdom in Kings. We get more about the activities of some of the kings in Chronicles. As we look at Solomon's progress and his wealth and his growing the kingdom, as we look at Solomon in both Kings and Chronicles, we see one of his first major projects is to carry out his father's ambition, which is to build the temple. David had prepared everything. David basically had prepaid a whole lot of it, prepared material and so forth, had Hiram, the king of Tyre, contract with him to supply materials and skilled workmen, but David wasn't allowed to build the temple. So now Solomon is going to carry out the plan. And we recognize that Solomon has to go and renew relations with Hiram and carry this out. Now, when the temple is completed, we have a tremendous description of it in 1 Kings chapter 6 and the furnishings of it in chapter 7. Now you come into 1 Kings chapter 8, you find that the Ark of the Covenant is brought into the temple, and then Solomon begins to bless the Lord, to thank the Lord, and to extol the Lord in this prayer of dedication and to appeal to the Lord. It's interesting how often you can drive around town here in Atlanta or in the general area, and you'll see these bumper stickers that reference either 1 Kings chapter 8 and verse 36 or the parallel passage in Chronicles, 1 Chronicles chapter 7 or 2 Chronicles chapter 7, where we have the reference to Solomon's prayer and the statement, if my people, or if your people have sinned and they turn and acknowledge their sin, then hear in heaven and relent or redeem them. And it's interesting how often you see that sentiment displayed on billboards and bumper stickers and things without any context whatsoever. The implication as it's being applied is, oh, we are God's people, we, this nation. And this nation is not Israel. This nation is not Solomon's people, God's people in that sense. Now, there's a principle there in Solomon's words. Yes, if we sin and go astray and then repent, God is willing for us to repent. In fact, how many times do we read in the New Testament that God is not willing that any should perish? Passages like 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 4, and 2 Peter chapter 1, or chapter 3 rather, and verses 8, 9, and 10, if memory serves me. That God is not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance, that all should come to a knowledge of the truth. God has never had in mind the desire to condemn anyone. And this simply is a reflection of that sentiment on his part. Now, Solomon, in the process of building the temple, renews David's relationship with Hiram. The temple is built. It takes years of time, 7 years to construct the temple. It takes 13 years for Solomon to build his palace. Hiram is also involved in that. But once the temple is completed, the Ark of the Covenant is brought in. Solomon offers this prayer of dedication and repentance and renewal and so forth. And then the sacrifices begin. But how does God respond to Solomon's prayer? What events take place when Solomon is finished with his prayer? You look down here in 2 Chronicles, God consumed Solomon's sacrifices with fire from heaven, fire and smoke and thunder from heaven. The acknowledgement that, okay, I accept this house as mine. The irony of that is we'll jump down the stream of time about 350 years to the days of King Zedekiah, the last king in Judah. And in the meantime, the captives that are already in Babylon with Ezekiel are arguing with him that, oh no, the temple is still standing, so there's no way that God can be angry with us. The temple is our lucky charm. The temple proves that God still approves of what we're doing. And the point is made, you keep reciting the temple, the temple, the temple, the temple, as if that's some kind of a lucky talisman. If that's how you're viewing it, God says, I'll take it away. If that's what it takes to get you to see how bad you've behaved, I'll take the temple away. And sure enough, he does with the destruction of Nebuchadnezzar's visit. Now, after the dedication of the temple, lost my train of thought for just a second there, we have the record of the Lord appearing to Solomon and various and sundry other things that he does. And then we're introduced in chapter 10 of 1 Kings to the Queen of Sheba, an Arabian queen who comes to test Solomon's wisdom. She's heard about him. She has heard of his great wealth and prosperity, but most of all, she's heard about how wise, not just smart, but how wise he is. And her curiosity is piqued. Now, this is a characteristic of the people of her part of the world, that they're fascinated with hard questions and riddles and so forth. So she comes to test him. And she asks questions and he answers wisely. He shows her his kingdom. And her assessment of Solomon's wisdom is what? I didn't believe it. And come to find out, it was double what I thought. The half has not been told. This is extravagant. This is extraordinary. Your wisdom and your prosperity surpass the report that I have heard. You're even smarter than I was told, and you're richer than I could have imagined. And she brought him gifts, and he sent her home with gifts. And there is nothing in the scriptures that accords with Cecil B. DeMille's depiction of this, that they fell in love and had a child. It's interesting that the claim is made primarily by the Rastafarians, whose roots, they're best known to us from Jamaica, but their roots are actually in Ethiopia and Sudan. The claim is made that their religion descends from Haile Selassie, who is himself a direct descendant of Solomon through the Queen of Sheba. But the Queen of Sheba is not from Ethiopia. Sheba was part of Arabia in the ancient world. Anyway, that's neither here nor there for our purposes. That's free. But as we go along in First Kings, we have heavy focus on Solomon's prosperity, his wealth. He has a navy built in conjunction with Hiram, and they trade all over the world. And this is the source of Solomon's wealth, is the levies, the taxes. As he lives in a crossroads region, so as people are traveling back and forth, he gets a cut. In some circumstances, Solomon's even an arms dealer to some of the neighboring peoples, but he becomes astonishingly wealthy as a part of this, to the point that even the cups from which he drank were made of gold. And so you're looking at something that is just astoundingly rich. But you come into chapter 11 in First Kings, Solomon loved many foreign women. In fact, as we review Solomon's practices, the writer of Kings tells us that he had 700 wives dubbed as princesses. And on top of that, he's got a harem of 300 concubines who, they don't have any claim, they don't have any title, but they're kept at his expense for his entertainment, for his use, as it were. And it's these foreign women, wives and concubines, who turn his heart away from God. They're idolaters. Notice what it says. He married Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, Hittites. He married women from the nations that Hebrews were specifically forbidden to marry. Well, why would he do that? If he's so smart, if he's so upright, why would he do that? Along with his wealth and his wisdom. Now, this is not from God. This is from Solomon with the devil's encouragement. There seems to have been there's tremendous wealth, there's tremendous wisdom or insight, and there's tremendous ego as well. And so Solomon, well, I'm the king, I can do what I want. And who's going to argue with him besides the Lord himself? Ultimately, we'll see that the Lord raises up opposition to him because of his unrighteousness. You look at chapter 11 and verse 9 in First Kings, the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. God appears to Solomon 3 times in the course of his life. Once to bless him, once to warn him, and once to basically reject him, tell him, you've really fouled up. So God raises up adversaries to trouble him. One of them is Hadad, and another is Rezin, the king of Syria. As Solomon ages out of his reign, he reigns like his father and like Saul before, 40 years. You got 40 years for Saul, 40 years for David, 40 years for Solomon. So this is 120 years of 12 tribes as one nation, one kingdom. Solomon dies, and Rehoboam, his son, becomes king. Rehoboam is the child of a wife that Solomon had married apparently before he became king, because Rehoboam is older at the time that he becomes king than the number of years his father ruled. Rehoboam is a foolish son. And it's Rehoboam's actions that lead to the dividing of the kingdom. Now, the dividing of the kingdom was foretold in Solomon's day. And Jeroboam had already been picked by God before the kingdom divided. Jeroboam had been a very able administrator and servant in Solomon's kingdom until it became known that Jeroboam had been selected through a prophet of God to rule 10 of the 12 tribes. And then Jeroboam had to flee to Egypt to be safe from Solomon, who wanted him executed. After Solomon's death, Jeroboam comes back to be the spokesman for the elders of the 10 northern tribes who are appealing to Rehoboam. Your father taxed us into oblivion. Could you lighten the load a little bit? Solomon's counselors say, if you'll lighten the load, these people will worship you, basically. They'll be faithful to you. And Rehoboam's counselors, younger men, basically approach this and say, you better get your bluff in on them now and show them just who's tough and who's not. And that's the way he chooses. So under Jeroboam's leadership, the 10 northern tribes, every tribe but Judah and Benjamin, turn away from Rehoboam's leadership. They refuse to accept Rehoboam as king. And they go home, basically. Jeroboam, having been their spokesman, is now presented with the opportunity to become king. And God sends a prophet to Jeroboam with this promise: if you'll be faithful to me, I'll establish your house. I'll bless you just like I'm blessing the house of David. And Jeroboam responds to this by establishing idolatry in place of proper worship. You look at 1 Kings chapter 12, and the statement is made that the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold, verse 28. And he said to the people, you have gone up to Jerusalem long enough. Behold your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Now, the older translations say it's too much trouble for you to go to Jerusalem. He also made temples in high places and appointed priests from among all the people who were not of the Levites. From this point on, every time this man is mentioned in the scriptures, he's described as Jeroboam, who taught Israel to sin, who led Israel into idolatry, in other words. Now, Shemaiah is the prophet that God sent to Jeroboam. But Jeroboam ignores Shemaiah's words and builds the golden calves at Dan in the north and at Bethel in the far south. Now, when God sends him another prophet to warn him about his idolatry, Jeroboam gives orders, silence that man, kill that prophet. And as he points at him, he contracts leprosy and he's unable to draw his hand back. He appeals to that prophet, pray to the Lord your God on my behalf, which the prophet does. And Jeroboam's hand is restored. But the thing that stands out here is that he does not repent of his idolatry. Now, it's this prophet, unnamed in chapter 13, who also foretells that in the days of Josiah, that a king named Josiah would rise, who would defile the altars that Jeroboam has caused to be built. And he would do so by burning the bones of false prophets on them. This is 330 years before the fact. And he's mentioned by name in this setting. Now, this prophet, unnamed, was instructed by God, you go, you do the job that I've given you to do, and when you leave, you go a different way home, and you don't stop to eat, you don't stop to drink. And in the meantime, Ahijah, who is an older prophet there at Bethel, hears from his sons of what has happened. Saddles his donkey, goes and chases down the younger prophet, and lies to him to get him to come home and share a meal. Why had Ahijah not been prophesying against this false altar? Don't know. Why did Ahijah lie to this young man about having received a prophecy from God saying, change your orders, go home with me? We can only speculate. Perhaps he was feeling alone. Perhaps he was feeling lonesome. Maybe he just wanted to be associated with a man who had shown greater courage, greater fortitude than he had. We don't have an explanation for why he did this, but he led the young man into sin, and the young man, as a result, lost his life. God sent a prophecy through Ahijah. Here's what's going to happen to you, young prophet. You're going to leave here, and a lion is going to maul you and kill you. That's what happens. And they see then, the people see the young prophet's body in the road with the lion sitting beside it on one side, the donkey standing beside it on the other side. And the prophecy has come to pass. And Ahijah goes, collects the body, and they give him a burial there. Now, it's another Ahijah who is going to end up rebuking King Asa for relying on the king of Assyria, or king of Syria rather. But we'll get to that in a moment. Jeroboam is going to live out his days and die. 22 years, and he's replaced by his son Nadab. Nadab, we usually associate that name with Aaron's son, the priest, who with his brother Abihu offered strange fire on the altar and was consumed back in Leviticus chapter 10. Under Jeroboam's administration, there would be no stigma associated with naming a child Nadab. And so Jeroboam's son takes over and rules in his place, and he's not going to last long. Rehoboam has reigned 17 years. But during his rule, he's had trouble with the Egyptians. He's on the Egyptian side of things. Shishak, the king of Egypt, loots Jerusalem. Rehoboam loots the treasury of the temple to pay off Shishak. And one of the things that winds up going to Egypt are the golden shields that Solomon had constructed and displayed in the palace and so forth, and in the temple. These things all go to Egypt, and Rehoboam replaces them with brass, and then keeps the brass locked up in the guardhouse as if it has some tremendous value that he doesn't want to lose. Well, Rehoboam dies, and he is replaced by Abijam, his son, or Abijah. And then shortly after, Jeroboam in Israel will die. and be replaced. Now, Abijam, not a lot is said about him really, but he's not a great king. For the sake of David, God spares Judah during his reign. And when he dies, then Asa becomes king in Judah. And this is during the reign of Jeroboam still in Israel. So things are changing fast here. We have just a short reign in Judah for Abijam, and Asa becomes king. Then we have a short reign after Jeroboam's death for Nadab, and we're going to see him replaced very shortly. The next outstanding king, you have Baasha in Israel, and then Elah, and then the rapid succession, Zimri and Omri, leading up to Ahab. You have change of dynasties, change of families every so often. Baasha becomes king by assassinating Nadab, and then Elah replaces him. Baasha lives in Israelite history as the assassin. To call somebody Baasha is to call them a murderer in that setting. We'll see that later on. But it's during this time that Jehoshaphat becomes king in Judah, and Ahab, one of the better known kings in Israel, ascends to the throne there. Ahab has as his claim to fame that he married a Sidonian princess named Jezebel. And it's during this time that the prophet Elijah comes on the scene and becomes prominent. Elijah is going to contend back and forth with Ahab. The interesting thing is, as we pointed out last week, is that Elijah is not the only prophet that Ahab interacts with. There's also Isaiah, who is sending Ahab information and messages about how he ought to correct, how he ought to change, and so forth. All of these things going on, God appealing to his people, even though they're steeped in sin, to repent, to turn back. And so Elijah contends with Ahab, while Hanani deals with Jehoshaphat in the south and scolds him for having an alliance with Ahab, for holding hands and playing footsie with Ahab, and so forth. Ahab actually has a shipping alliance with Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat makes a shipping alliance with Ahab that let's get together and increase our trade. And God sends a prophet named Eliezer of Dodavahu to say, this is not good, to tell Jehoshaphat, this is not good for you, this is not good for the nation. And so God is not going to let this go forward. And the ships that they're building are demolished, they're wrecked before they ever can put them into use and become rich through them. Now, that brings us then up to the time of Elijah, of Elisha becoming Elijah's successor. Before we get to that, we'll have Elijah go to Mount Carmel and confront the false prophets of Baal. Elijah will be vindicated there. How long go you halting or limping between two gods? If the Lord is God, serve him. If Baal is God, serve him. The people answered not a word. There's a sermon in that. And when God vindicates Elijah, then the people all respond, oh, the Lord is God, the Lord is God. But they didn't change their behavior. They were very willing, when God manifested himself, to acknowledge, yeah, you're the real God. But they didn't change anything. And of course, then Jezebel sends word to Elijah, I'm going to kill you just like you killed my prophets. And Elijah then has to run for his life, goes from the mountaintop of vindication and success, in a sense, to the valley of despair and desperation, running away from Jezebel's wrath. And he goes 40 days down to Horeb, which is the opposite side of Mount Sinai. It's the other side of the same mountain, basically. And there God speaks to him, not in the fire, not in the storm, not in the earthquake, but in a quiet voice. And what does God say? Elijah says, I'm the only one that's left. I'm the only one faithful. And he knows that's not right, because Ahab's right-hand man, Obadiah, is a faithful servant of God. Astonishing that he could serve Ahab. But he's also preserved 100 prophets of God from Jezebel. So Elijah, carrying on, I'm the only one left, just let me die. And God says, I've still got 7,000 faithful. Now you go back and you anoint Hazael to be the next king of Syria, and you anoint Jehu to be the next king of Israel, and you go find Elisha to be your successor. And then what's going to happen to Elijah? Okay, then you're done. So that's a good place for us to stop and take a break right quick, and we'll come back and continue our review after the break. Questions or thoughts before we break? Okay, it is 7:47. We'll start at about a minute past 8. Okay, now let me close the door. All right, we had left off with Elijah anointing 2 new kings and a new prophet. And so we are going to see Elijah then taken up directly, bodily, from this earth. We don't see him die, and Elisha will become his replacement. In the meantime, of course, we have Ahab's desire for Naboth's vineyard, and Jezebel engineering the murder of Naboth so that Ahab can have his property. Micaiah, another prophet of God, prophesies against Ahab and against the prosperity of Ahab and Jehoshaphat putting together any kind of cooperative effort. Ahab's comment about Micaiah is, I hate him because he never prophesies anything good about me. Well, you know, when you don't walk with God, you don't get nice things said about you. But in this, Ahab winds up being killed in battle because he has gone up against the king of Syria. Jehoshaphat reigns in Jerusalem after the death of Ahab, and Ahab is replaced then. Moab rebels, and Ahaziah is the replacement. Now, Jehu, I'm sorry, I lost my place in my notes here for just a moment. As we go into 2 Kings, we actually go back a little bit in time. Elijah is still conducting his prophetic work at this point, denouncing Ahaziah. And it's in 2 Kings chapter 2 that Elijah is taken up and Elisha becomes his successor. During this period, we have both Israel and Judah not being particularly prosperous because they're not being particularly faithful. Jehoshaphat, on balance, has seemed to be a pretty good king in Judah, but it's Jehoshaphat who can't seem to resist playing footsie with Ahab and the idolatry of Ahab and arranging marriage with his family and so forth. And so Jehoram, Ahab's son, becomes king after Ahab dies, and they continue this relationship that is not healthy for Jehoshaphat and the people of Judah. The king of Israel goes with the king of Judah and the king of Edom. They're involved in warfare, and Elisha has to come and scold Jehoshaphat for this relationship and emphasize this is not good. This is not pleasing to God. This is not good for your nation. This is not good for you as the leader of God's people. In the meantime, as we progress through 2 Kings, we find a number of the miracles that are performed by Elisha, much in the same vein of some of the things that Elijah had done. The miracle of the widow's oil and so forth, the raising of the Shunammite woman's child, purifying a deadly stew, and healing Naaman of leprosy. We're introduced to Elisha's servant here in chapter 5 in 2 Kings, Gehazi, who takes it upon himself to appropriate some of Naaman's wealth, and along with his wealth inherits Naaman's leprosy as well. As we progress along, we see Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria, Syria being the large neighbor immediately to the north of Israel. Ben-Hadad lays siege to the city of Samaria, and things get so bad in Samaria that people are starving and practicing cannibalism in order to survive. And Elisha sends word that God is going to rescue his people in spite of their idolatry, in spite of their ungodliness. The elders are sitting with Elisha in his house. The king has sent a messenger to execute Elisha, but in the meantime, he has a message to send back to the king, and the king himself comes. Here's the word of the Lord: tomorrow about this time, food will be plentiful. Well, how so? God is going to deliver Israel, this unrighteous, ungodly people. God is nevertheless going to deliver them from the Syrians. This is where we're introduced to the case of the 4 lepers outside the city who go and discover that God has discomfited. God has basically chased away the Syrian army in panic, and they've left behind all their food and equipment, which then the Israelites are able to go out and plunder. And so sure enough, food is plentiful and cheap the very next day. And the advisor to King Joram that had scoffed at this is there to see and administer it, and winds up being trampled rather than getting to partake of it. So prophecy is fulfilled there. It's at this point that the kings begin to be a little bit confusing to us, because we have Jehoram in Israel, and then after Jehoshaphat, Jehoram, his son, becomes king in Judah. And we have 2 King Jehorams at the same time, one in Israel and one in Judah. And on top of that, they're related to each other by marriage. Jehoram in Judah is, he's not a good king. He's too much related to Ahab's family, to his kinfolks in Israel. And so when he dies, then Ahaziah becomes king in Judah. And he is likewise evil, an unrighteous king, not a good influence on God's people. It's at this point then that Jehu, now we've already seen one Jehu who is a prophet, but it's at this point that Jehu, that Elijah had anointed, is going to become king in Israel. And his job as king, or as the one anointed, is to bring an end to Ahab's dynasty, to Ahab's family. God has declared judgment against Ahab and his family. Jehu is his instrument of judgment. And it's at this point that Elisha has come back to him and said, hey, it's time. He sends a man to anoint Jehu among his peers, basically, among his fellow. He's a general to the king at this point. So Jehu is now going to be anointed to be king, and he takes over. They remove Jehoram the king, and Jehu takes his place. Now, Jehu gets an unusual, I guess you could call it a blessing or a benefit, in that he was obedient to the will of the Lord in doing this thing. Now, he's not a godly man. He's an idolater. He's a scoundrel. He's a rascal, just like every other king of Israel. But in this, he was faithful to the Lord, or maybe we should say obedient to the Lord. It served his purpose too, because it led to him being king. But because of this, his descendants to the fourth generation will follow him on the throne of Israel. This is, if memory serves me, the longest dynasty of the 9 different families that ruled over Israel. This is the longest series of successions. You've got 4 in a row that are father, son, father, son, father, son. And so that's unusual in this respect. And so he assassinates Joram and Ahaziah, the king of Judah, as well, because Ahaziah had come to visit with Jehoram, the king of Israel. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And after this, he executes Jezebel, Ahab's widow. There's nothing left of her to bury. And then he slaughters Ahab's descendants, 70 sons. Takes the family out altogether and strikes down the prophets of Baal. This is a good thing, but he does not turn back to God. It's at this point that Jewish Kingdom of Judah history takes a wild left-hand turn, because Athaliah, who is the mother of King Ahaziah, seizes power. Her son has died, and so she seizes power and proceeds then to eliminate all of her own descendants who could become king. And she's going to reign in Jerusalem for 6 years. How far gone did the priesthood and the people have to be to allow this to happen? They were pretty far from God. The only thing that saves them is that one grandchild, Joash, is hidden away for 6 years. He is an infant when this takes place. He's going to be 7 years old when Jehoiada, the priest, brings him out of hiding and has him crowned king. And Jehoash now is going to repair the temple. He's going to lead the people in the right way as long as Jehoiada, the priest, lives. And then after Jehoiada dies, Jehoash kind of goes a little astray. Jehoahaz now becomes king in Israel after Jehu. And this is the first of 2 King Jehoahazes, because we'll see one in Judah later on. As we go along, we find the death of Elisha at this point, and Amaziah becomes king in Judah. And we see a rapid succession of kings in Israel and Judah. Azariah then follows Amaziah. Zechariah reigns in Israel, followed by Shallum and Menachem and Pekahiah and Pekah, just in rapid succession. And then we come to Jotham and Ahaz in Judah. Now, just touching over these, I'm trying to basically kind of touch everybody. Not every detail of all of this will be on the final, and so I want to emphasize that's why I'm approaching this in this way, if you will. So as we look at the record of these different individuals, let me get to where I need to be. We have Amaziah as king, and one of the things that stands out about him is that he goes to war against Edom. He's got 300,000 men of his own. But before he goes to war, he goes to the king of Israel and hires 100,000 mercenaries, 100,000 men of Israel to come and fight with him, only to be told by God's spokesman, God's prophet, you don't need them. Trust God for your victory instead of your number of soldiers, and God will deliver. So he sends them home. Well, what happens when he sends them home? They feel like they have been deprived, robbed of their pay, robbed of plunder and spoil. So they tear up Judah along the way home. Now, after Amaziah, we have, let me turn back and make sure I speak the right name. We have Azariah in Judah, and Azariah is one of those kings who's known by two different names. We have Azariah in 2 Kings chapter 15, and Uzziah, and more details about him over in 2 Chronicles. And Uzziah, on balance, a pretty good king, falls afoul of God, falls short of God, and is punished so that his son has to step in and reign in his place. Now, he's still alive, but because of his sin, he's punished with disease and can't be around his people. He has to live exiled, basically. And it's during this time frame that Israel, the northern kingdom, under the rulership of their final king, Hoshea, is taken into captivity by the Assyrians. The Assyrians have now become the dominant empire in the world. They were a kingdom previously, and now they have become an empire. And they are going to pose a real problem to the kings of Judah now that Israel has been taken captive. The Assyrians have deported the Israelites, the 10 northern tribes. They have imported into Israel's territory pagan people, and because of the idolatry of the pagan people, God sent a plague of lions. And we talked about the Asiatic lions and how that they're extinct in that area now, but they were plentiful in those days. God sent a plague of lions on those people until they brought in a priest to educate them about God. They had a very parochial, land-based concept of all deities, all idols, and they thought God was just another idol. So you look at 2 Kings chapter 17, and talking about this, it says here at verse 32, they feared the Lord and appointed from themselves all sorts of people as priests of the high places, who sacrificed for them in the shrines of the high places. So they feared the Lord. They offered sacrifices to him, but they also served their own gods after the manner of the nations from whom they had been carried away. And then the writer says, to this day they do according to the former manner. They do not fear the Lord, and they do not follow the statutes or the rules or the law or the commandment of the Lord commanded the children of Jacob, whom he named Israel. The Israelites had been expelled for doing these very things, and the idolatrous people who were brought in their place largely followed in the same path. But they were tolerated once they were educated somewhat, because they didn't go to the excess that the Israelites had gone. Now, Hezekiah now becomes king in Judah, and Hezekiah is going to have to deal with the Assyrians. The Assyrian Empire comes knocking on the gates, demanding submission, demanding surrender. Now, Hezekiah starts out well. Hezekiah is the one who cuts down the high places and breaks down the pillars and rids the land of the Asherah. In fact, it's during the early part of Hezekiah's reign that they encounter people worshiping the brass serpent from Moses' day. And Hezekiah has it demolished. He destroys it. And they'd been making offerings to it like it was some kind of representative of God, or maybe a God in its own right. And Hezekiah demolishes it and calls it Nehushtan, a thing of brass. It's just a piece of brass. There's nothing special about it, was the gist of what he said and did here. Now, as Hezekiah goes on, Sennacherib, the Assyrian emperor, attacks Judah, and he takes over all the fortified cities on the northern border of Judah, which would be in the area of where the border meets with Israel. So he has encroached on Judah's territory now, and it's Sennacherib who sends the Rabshakeh to demand that Judah submit, surrender. And here we have this interlude with Sennacherib's emissaries talking to King Hezekiah's representatives at the gate of the city on the wall, trying to intimidate all the people of Jerusalem. Now, the Assyrians have Hezekiah closed up in Jerusalem. He's under siege. They describe him as being like a bird in a cage. At one point, he says, look, my master says, I'll give you 2,000 horses if you can put enough riders on them to field them as cavalry. And of course, Hezekiah doesn't have that kind of resources locked up in the city with him. And so they threaten and try to intimidate. The Rabshakeh claims that it's your God who brought me here to destroy you, to make you captives. And what makes you think your God is strong enough to deliver you, and so forth. He blasphemes God in trying to intimidate God's people. And so it's here in chapter 19 in 2 Kings that we encounter Isaiah. As we talked about last week, Isaiah has information, has an instruction for King Hezekiah to not be fearful, to trust the Lord. Do not be afraid, because the Lord is on your side. Well, now the Rabshakeh comes back with a written demand. And Hezekiah receives the letter from his messengers, takes it into the temple, lays it out before the Lord and said, here it is, Lord, here's what they're demanding. Read it for yourself, so to speak. And Isaiah then has a prophecy for Hezekiah that Sennacherib will fall. And sure enough, he does. He withdraws because of machinations back at home that we talked about last week, how his sons were fighting amongst themselves for who would be the next ruler of Assyria. Turns out Esarhaddon is the one that Sennacherib had anointed, and he winds up, even though he's the younger son, he winds up being the next emperor in spite of his brother's efforts. But Sennacherib goes home to try to settle this and is murdered by his own sons, not by Esarhaddon, but by Adramelech and the other one whose name escapes me off the top of my head. So Isaiah's prophecy is fulfilled. In the bargain, God sends the angel of the Lord to strike down the Assyrian army. And as you come to the end of 2 Kings chapter 19, 185,000 Assyrians are slaughtered in one night by the angel of the Lord, by God's emissary or God's messenger. The other son of Sennacherib is named Sharezer. Adramelech and Sharezer are his sons who murder him, and Esarhaddon defeats them in battle and becomes the emperor, which is what Sennacherib had in mind all along. So that brings us then to the days of Hezekiah's illness. That seems to be right almost immediately on the heels of these events that Hezekiah becomes ill. Isaiah comes and says, God said, you better get your will up to date. You're going to die. And Hezekiah turns to the wall and begins to pray a prayer, not a self-righteous, boastful prayer, but a prayer just, Lord, remember, this is the kind of person I've tried to be. And God doesn't even let Isaiah get out of the palace before he sends him back. I've given you 15 more years. Now, there are a couple of things significant about this. Hezekiah is basically 39 or 40 years old at this time that he becomes ill, and he doesn't have any children, doesn't have any sons yet. Manasseh is going to be born 3 years after this. So God gives Hezekiah 15 years. In addition to this, he'll be 55 now when he dies. And when he is 43, Manasseh will be born. So he's not going to die childless. Manasseh will follow him. Manasseh will have the longest reign of any king in Judah. He starts out extraordinarily evil, burning his own children in flames to Moloch or Molech, and is taken away into captivity in Babylon, where he repents and is then restored to Jerusalem. And somewhere in this 55 years that he reigns, as these events take place, his heart changes, and the last years of his life, he is much more submissive and faithful to God than he was in the beginning of his reign. So there is a dramatic change in the man whose claim to fame was the evil that he did early in his reign. Manasseh is the father of Josiah. Josiah is the last righteous king in Judah. And Josiah, 8 years old, the boy king, follows the example of his grandfather Hezekiah to try to straighten things out, turn things around, does what's right in the eyes of the Lord, did not turn to the right or the left, but he only has 31 years. And then he is taken out of the way so that he does not live to see God's judgment on Judah. It's Pharaoh Necho who is on his way to fight the Assyrians at the Battle of Carchemish, whose army kills Josiah. Now, Pharaoh's power is about to be permanently broken at this point. The Egyptians from this point on will be a paper tiger in conflict with the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and so forth. But against the Egyptians, Josiah and the army of Judah are no match. God lets Josiah be killed in battle so that he does not live to see the destruction of his people and the temple. It's during the reign of Josiah, though, that the temple is repaired. The book of the law is found by Hilkiah the priest, the high priest. And that discovery is the impetus for a whole lot of the reforms and corrections that the people make, that Josiah makes and enforces on the people. It's Josiah who invites, or rather it was Hezekiah who invited the tribes of Israel to join in the Passover. Most of them scorned, but some of them joined. Josiah straightens things out to the point that they can keep the Passover again, and then he's taken out of the way. This is an act of God at Megiddo to spare him seeing what's going to happen. Josiah's successors, his son Jehoahaz, 23 years old, reigns 3 months. He's an evil man, and it's Pharaoh Necho that takes him off the throne and puts his son or his brother Eliakim in his place. It's Necho who changes Eliakim's name to Jehoiakim, and Jehoiakim is going to reign for 11 years. Now, it's at this point, this is between 609 and 606 BC, that the power of the Egyptians is being broken. The power of the Assyrians is about to shift dramatically because the Babylonians, who are part of the Assyrian Empire and who serve as high-ranking officers in the Assyrian army, the Babylonians are about to seize power from the Assyrians. And it's no longer going to be the Assyrian Empire, but now the Babylonian Empire. And this act of changing the rulership in Jerusalem is basically the last real influence that the Egyptians are able to exert or enforce on Judah. So Jehoahaz goes away into Egypt. Eliakim becomes Jehoiakim and swears loyalty to Pharaoh Necho, who then is vanquished in battle at Carchemish by the Assyrians and goes home to lick his wounds. And the Assyrians then are replaced by the Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar, who comes in 606 and puts Jehoiakim under his thumb. Jehoiakim had sworn to be loyal to the Egyptians because they put him on the throne. But now Nebuchadnezzar is the dominant power. And so it takes no time at all until he turns around and, okay, I'm your servant, Nebuchadnezzar. And of course, the Egyptians immediately begin to jockey to bring him back to their side. So in 597, Jehoiakim is replaced not by the Egyptians, but by Nebuchadnezzar. Jehoiakim is replaced with Jehoiachin, his son. Jehoiakim dies. Jehoiachin becomes king. Jehoiachin is 18 years old. He reigns 3 months. His mother's name is Nehushta, brassy woman. And it's Nebuchadnezzar who removes him and puts Mattaniah, whose name he changes to Zedekiah, on the throne. It's at this point that Ezekiel and most of the middle class are deported to Babylonian captivity. Remember, Daniel had been deported along with the children of the royalty in 606 when Nebuchadnezzar first came to power. So now he's going to take the middle class and the tradespeople and so forth and deport them. They can own property, they can own houses, they're not slaves, but they are there for the benefit of the Babylonian Empire, not for the benefit of Judah. And Zedekiah becomes king. He's going to be the last king to sit on David's throne in Jerusalem. From Zedekiah forward, there will never, ever be another descendant of David on his throne in Jerusalem. In fact, when Jehoiachin is taken away by Nebuchadnezzar into captivity in Babylon and is replaced by Zedekiah, Jeremiah, over in Jeremiah chapter 22, records of Jehoiachin, write this man childless, no descendant of his will prosper, sitting on the throne of David, his father, in Jerusalem. Well, who is the descendant of Jehoiachin. He's not a childless man, but no descendant of his will prosper on David's throne in Jerusalem. Go over to Matthew chapter 1, guess what? He has children. Shealtiel is his son. And who's descended from Shealtiel? Jesus. So what Jeremiah is telling us is that Jesus is not going to come back and reign on David's throne in Jerusalem unless Jeremiah is a liar. Well, that brings us down then to the conclusion of the kingdom of Judah. Zedekiah, with the Babylonians still promising support, or the Egyptians rather, still promising support if you'll just be faithful to us and stand with us against the Babylonians. Well, they don't have any power to stand against the Babylonians, either the Jews or the Egyptians. So in 586, because Zedekiah has again quit paying his taxes to Babylon, basically, has rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar, now the army comes in from Babylon and they demolish Jerusalem. They lay siege to the city. Jeremiah is in the city during this time advocating, so open the gates and surrender. That's the only way you're going to survive. This is not a contest between nations. This is a contest between you in your sin and God in his righteousness. God has brought his servant Nebuchadnezzar to your gates because of your sin. The only right thing to do is open the gates and surrender and accept God's punishment, and they wouldn't do it. So Nebuchadnezzar's troops demolish the city, demolish the temple, capture Zedekiah. The last thing he sees in this world is the slaying of his sons, and then they poke his eyes out, they blind him and take him away in chains into captivity. The general that Nebuchadnezzar has put over things appoints a man named Gedaliah to be the governor, to administer the ruins of Jerusalem and Judah. What a job that would be. And 2 months into his responsibilities, Gedaliah is murdered by Ishmael and some of the remnants, the renegade remnants of the Jewish army who've been hiding out in the hills. The remnants of the people, after Ishmael and his band of cutthroats are executed, the remnants of the people come to Jeremiah and ask, should we stay here where the Babylonians are liable to be angry with us because of the murder of Gedaliah, or should we run away to safety in Egypt? Jeremiah speaks for God and says, stay here, trust God, and he'll take care of you. And they say, nope, we're going to Egypt. And they basically kidnap Jeremiah, and off to Egypt they go, even though he has told them, if you run away to Egypt, you will die in Egypt. There won't be any safety there for you. That's the last we hear of them. In the meantime, at the very end of the book of 2 Kings, 37 years later, the ruler of Babylon, who is now a man named Evil-Merodach, brings Jehoiachin, who is at this point an old man who has been in captivity all these years, brings him out of captivity, raises him up into his court, and sets him over all the other conquered kings, puts him in a place of honor, and appoints him an allowance for the rest of his life. He's allowed to be elevated and honored as a king. He's the last remaining king, even though he's a captive of Judah at this point. And that's where 2 Kings ends. You find the same basic ending at the end of 2 Chronicles, though Ezra, traditionally the writer of Chronicles, gives us a lot more detail along the way. Now, the last thing that you find in Chronicles takes us 50 years farther down the road to the time of Cyrus. In 539, the Medes and the Persians, who were tributary nations, subject nations to the east and north of Babylon, the Medes and the Persians form a coalition kingdom where a Mede would rule, and then a Persian would rule, and then a Mede would rule, and then a Persian would rule. And we find that Darius the Mede overthrows the Babylonian yoke. And so in 536 now, Cyrus, who is the king of Persia, the Medo-Persian Empire that has basically conquered and inherited everything, the 127 provinces of Babylon's empire. Cyrus now in 536 issues the famous promised decree that says Judah and anybody of the tribes of Israel who want to are now free to go home. There is a sea change in the policy of the Medo-Persians compared to the Assyrians and the Babylonians, where the Assyrians and the Babylonians deported people to strange lands and tried to settle them there and stamp out their native identity. The Medo-Persians don't do that. In fact, they let as many people as want to return to their native lands. And as we'll see in Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther in the fall, about 50,000 Jews over a period of time will return to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple and the city walls and reestablish the kingdom of Judah. After 3 generations in Babylonian captivity, most Jews from this point on will never again live in the land of Judah. From the time of Babylonian captivity on, most Jews will live in the Gentile world. They'll separate themselves into little separate communities in the major cities, but they will interact with the Gentile world. By the time of Jesus in the 1st century, there are synagogues and Jewish communities in every major city in the world, from Spain to India, from the Sudan in Africa to Britain and everywhere in between. And Jews, who make up at that point probably less than 5% of the Roman Empire's population, rise to positions of prominence and have extraordinary influence, all out of proportion to their actual numbers. But before captivity, almost all Jews lived just jam up together in the territory that Abraham received from God. After captivity, most Jews will never, ever live there. And probably most Jews will never actually even see that land. It will be the highlight of their lifetime to make a pilgrimage to see the temple once in their lifetimes. And of course, the temple that is rebuilt in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah is a poor man's copy of what Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed. And in the days of Jesus, the temple that Herod beautified and enlarged, which took almost 80 years to finish, is finished in 69 AD, just in time for the Romans to destroy it again. So that pretty well brings us, in terms of facts and things, to the end of our study. The final consists of 92 questions. It's a lot like the midterm. There are 20 call them multiple guess questions, A, B, C, D. There are 65, I believe, short answer questions. 68 short answer questions that you can answer with anything from a word to a sentence. And then there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 discussion questions that will require 2 or 3 paragraphs to address fully. The test is open Bible, open notes, whatever resources you've got, you're welcome to use. I will send it as soon as I get home tonight, and you've got a week to return it to me. Questions or comments or thoughts? We're a little bit early winding up tonight, but that's all right.
Hey, Dave, this is Sam.
Yes.
Yeah, my research paper.
Yes, sir.
Oh, have you finished looking at it?
I have not. I have
Okay.
begun to read over it. I have not finished grading it yet.
Oh, okay. All right.
Miss Mary, I have looked over your research paper as well. And I will say I would, the school's policy allows me to give you up to 90 days after the end of term to finish things. If you would like to do that and send me a finished copy when you're done, I really would prefer to grade that. I like what I've read so far. Brother Sam, I should finish your paper this week, and I'll have a grade for you, Lord willing, by this weekend.
Okay.
You can get back with me later, Miss Mary, if you want to think about that. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for taking the class. It's been my pleasure and my privilege to teach. If there's not anything else, then good night.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miss Rosalind. Glad to see you again.
Appreciate everything, Dave. Thank you so much.
All right, Brother Sam. I look forward to seeing you the next time our paths cross, and I'll
All right.
be in touch.
Okay. Take care.
Bye.
Good night, everybody.